In the dim glow of a London evening in May 1940, Winston Churchill paced the long corridors of 10 Downing Street with the weight of a nation pressing against his shoulders. The shadows cast by the flickering gas lamps seemed to mimic the uncertainty clouding every decision he faced. Europe was unraveling at a terrifying pace. The Wehrmacht had thundered through the Low Countries with shocking speed, and France, a century-old bastion of Western stability, teetered on the edge of collapse. Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, understood that the fate of Britain hung precariously in the balance. This was not the time for hesitation. Every hour could shift the scale between survival and annihilation. Behind the public veneer of speeches and wartime optimism, the British government grappled with an agonizing reality. The French army, long thought to be the cornerstone of Allied defense, was crumbling under the weight of blitzkrieg tactics. Communication lines were erratic, intelligence reports grim, and the morale of Londoners fragile yet defiant. Churchill's predecessors had underestimated the speed and ruthlessness of Hitler's strategies, but Churchill, steeped in the history of European wars and the intricacies of modern military theory, recognized a stark truth. Britain could no longer rely on a continental partner to shield it from the storm. As he surveyed maps of Europe sprawled across oak tables, Churchill's eyes lingered over Belgium, Holland, and northern France, regions now overrun with German forces. He could almost see the panicked retreat of Allied troops, the desperate scramble of civilians, and the relentless advance of mechanized divisions cutting across once quiet countrysides. Every arrow, every line on those maps represented thousands of lives, men and women caught in a theater of war that seemed to have no mercy. The machinery of conquest was efficient, ruthless, and terrifyingly swift. For the first time, the Prime Minister felt the heavy possibility that Britain might truly stand alone against the Axis powers. In private, Churchill wrestled with the implications of isolation. The Royal Navy remained the strongest instrument at Britain's disposal, yet it could not shield the nation from the overarching threat of aerial bombardment and potential invasion. Political allies across Europe had faltered, and diplomatic channels with the United States, though hopeful, had yet to yield tangible support. The stark reality crystallized. The destiny of Britain might depend entirely on British courage, ingenuity, and endurance. This was a nation staring into the abyss, forced to confront the unthinkable, survival without guaranteed assistance. Churchill's mind, honed over decades of political and military observation, traced the contours of strategy, supply, and morale. The looming specter of the Luftwaffe over London, the vulnerability of airfields, and the fragmented command structures in France all pointed toward an existential crisis. He knew that to merely hold on, Britain would need more than weapons or troops. It would require a national psyche forged in resilience. The Prime Minister realized that if France fell completely, Britain's isolation would not be temporary, but a protracted struggle demanding both tactical brilliance and unyielding spirit. Even as he considered military logistics, Churchill was acutely aware of the human dimension of war. Families in the bombed-out suburbs of Brussels, soldiers stranded on the beaches of Dunkirk, and civilians sheltering in Parisian basements were all echoes of the impending threat. He envisioned a Britain forced to endure relentless pressure from the air, to ration and conserve, to summon a collective courage that had never been tested on such a scale. Leadership, in this hour, was more than issuing orders. It was about embodying hope in the face of potential catastrophe. Reports from intelligence officers painted a stark mosaic of Germany's intentions. Hitler's ambitions were no longer abstract. They were manifest in every captured town, every shattered bridge, and every occupied airfield. German forces exploited speed, surprise, and coordination in ways the Allies had never fully anticipated. Each dispatch, each telegram, seemed to carry a double meaning, a warning of impending invasion and a testament to the peril of over-reliance on faltering allies. The night stretched long, yet Churchill remained resolute, drawing from history, intuition, and an unwavering commitment to the nation's survival. In these tense hours, Britain's fate began to crystallize not in grandiose speeches or political maneuvering, but in the sober acknowledgement of stark reality. The nation faced a moment of clarity, the certainty of impending danger, coupled with the uncertainty of assistance. Churchill realized that to lead effectively, he could not dwell on what allies might provide. He had to envision Britain standing alone, resilient and defiant, its people prepared to resist, endure, and, if necessary, fight to the last. This was the night when the gravity of leadership, the weight of history, and the urgency of survival converged into a singular, haunting clarity. The next morning, the atmosphere in Downing Street was taut, electric with the sense of unfolding calamity. Cabinet meetings became arenas of urgent deliberation, each minister bearing news that chipped away at illusions of continental support. Churchill, with his characteristic combination of gravitas and intensity, guided discussions not with panic, but with a stark appraisal of reality. The French front was collapsing, Belgian defenses had been swept aside, and the Low Countries were firmly under German control. Every report carried the same message. Britain's strategic options were narrowing rapidly. Behind the scenes, the Prime Minister engaged in painstaking consultations with military leaders, scrutinizing every operational plan with a meticulous eye. He asked questions that cut to the marrow of strategy. Where could reserves be deployed? How long could airfields withstand bombardment? What contingency existed if German armored divisions reached the Channel ports? The answers were sobering. Logistics, supply lines, and troop morale were under tremendous strain, and while Britain possessed formidable assets, their efficacy depended entirely on judicious use. The window for decisive action was perilously small. Churchill understood that the coming days would test both the courage of his commanders and the resolve of the nation. He began crafting contingency plans that accounted for isolation, including emergency evacuations, fortified coastal defenses, and measures to protect key industrial hubs. The machinery of government shifted into survival mode, balancing urgency with prudence, calculation with imagination. Every decision bore the imprint of existential stakes, shaping a framework for resistance that would define Britain's strategy throughout the war. The psychological dimension weighed heavily on Churchill. He was acutely aware that fear could paralyze both leaders and citizens. The news of rapid German victories reverberated across the press, and while Churchill could inspire hope publicly, privately he confronted the full scope of potential catastrophe. He recognized that leadership in such moments demanded a duality, projecting confidence while preparing for worst-case scenarios, instilling courage while planning for isolation. Britain's future depended on this delicate equilibrium between perception and preparation. By mid-May, intelligence indicated that the Wehrmacht's momentum could soon outstrip France's ability to resist. The Allies were on the brink of strategic collapse, and evacuation plans from ports like Dunkirk had to be considered not as contingency, but as necessity. The Prime Minister's focus shifted toward orchestrating large-scale logistics, coordinating with naval and air forces to ensure maximum efficiency, and fortifying Britain's home front. He understood that these efforts were more than military. They were moral imperatives, signaling to the population that endurance and resolve could defy even the most formidable adversary. Churchill's reflections extended beyond strategy into history and philosophy. He recalled the lessons of the Great War, of Napoleon's ambitions, and of Britain's enduring capacity to resist domination. Yet history offered no guarantees. The modern battlefield had evolved, and the threat of total invasion or sustained aerial bombardment introduced variables previously unimagined. The Prime Minister faced a complex interplay of technology, tactics, and human resilience, requiring a vision that combined immediate action with long-term survival. In these hours, the nature of Britain's potential isolation began to crystallize not just politically or militarily, but emotionally. Churchill recognized that the nation's identity, its spirit, and its capacity to endure depended on the collective fortitude of ordinary citizens. He envisioned families enduring blackout nights, factories running ceaselessly to supply armaments, and the population rallying behind a sense of purpose greater than individual survival. Leadership, in this context, demanded both strategic clarity and moral fortitude. The night drew close again, mirroring the tension of the previous evening, yet the Prime Minister's resolve deepened. He could not change the speed of the German advance, nor could he ensure the steadfastness of every Allied partner. What he could control, however, was Britain's preparation, its readiness, and its refusal to succumb to despair. The realization that the nation might truly stand alone did not diminish him. It galvanized him. Churchill embraced the heavy mantle of responsibility, fully aware that history would soon judge whether Britain could withstand the storm without reliance on foreign aid. As May 1940 pressed on, the grim reality of the continental collapse became undeniable. Reports from Paris carried an almost surreal cadence. German divisions cutting through the French countryside, bridges blown too late, cities abandoned in panic. Churchill watched each dispatch with a blend of dread and clarity, realizing that Britain's survival was no longer dependent on the French army, but entirely on its own capacities. The psychological weight of this realization was immense. He alone in Downing Street had to envision a strategy that could sustain the nation if Europe fell completely. The evacuation of Allied forces from Belgium and northern France, particularly from Dunkirk, became an urgent priority. Every hour lost increased the risk of encirclement. Churchill understood that the Royal Navy alone could not guarantee success. Improvisation and daring would be critical. Orders were dispatched to commandeer civilian vessels, organize fishing boats, and mobilize whatever maritime resources could traverse the channel. It was a desperate ballet, one of coordination under extreme duress, reflecting both human courage and the stark necessity of survival. Behind the scenes, Churchill's cabinet wrestled with the consequences of potential isolation. Some ministers feared political fallout, others saw defeat as inevitable, yet the Prime Minister remained steadfast. He recognized that leadership in such times required confronting hard truths, rejecting comforting illusions, and instilling purpose even as the Continental Allies faltered. The nation's fate might rest on endurance and ingenuity rather than military strength alone. Every decision, from rationing to defense strategy, became an act of existential calculation. In the air above Britain, reconnaissance planes reported German activity that suggested the next phase of aggression. The Luftwaffe preparing to establish air superiority over the Channel. Churchill's mind raced through options, fortifying radar stations, dispersing airfields, and reallocating fighter squadrons to choke points. He understood that the coming aerial battles were not just tactical contests. They would define whether Britain could maintain its independence and morale while standing alone. Victory or defeat in the air would set the tone for the nation's psychological and strategic endurance. Even as military measures unfolded, Churchill remained acutely attuned to the human dimension of war. Civilians in London and other urban centers were vulnerable to the shock of aerial bombardment. Factories struggled to produce weapons under the strain of labor shortages and logistical disruption. Families feared for the men on the front lines, and yet, in that fear, lay an opportunity to forge collective resilience. The Prime Minister began to craft speeches and communications designed to unite, to galvanize, and to prepare the populace for a conflict whose scale and duration would test every fiber of national character. Churchill also delved into contingency planning for leadership continuity. He could not assume the safety of his own government in the event of an invasion or sustained bombing campaign. Emergency relocation sites, secure communication lines, and succession protocols were discussed in precise, almost clinical detail. He recognized that leadership itself could become a target, and that without careful preparation, Britain's ability to withstand isolation could collapse from within. The burden of foresight weighed heavily, yet he bore it with resolute determination. At night, the Prime Minister often walked alone through the corridors of Downing Street, pondering maps and reports by lamplight. The silence of the city contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding on the continent. In those hours, Churchill confronted the enormity of his responsibility, the need to anticipate the enemy's moves, safeguard the nation's lifelines, and prepare citizens for a protracted struggle. The realization of possible isolation sharpened his resolve, transforming fear into a calculated focus on survival, defense, and moral leadership. By mid-May, the contours of Britain's potential standalone resistance began to crystallize. It was a nation dependent on naval supremacy, industrial output, civilian resolve, and an unwavering commitment to survival. Churchill understood that if France fell completely, Britain's destiny would hinge not on allies, but on its own strategic ingenuity and the courage of its people. In these crucial hours, The Prime Minister internalized a chilling truth. The nation could not falter, could not wait for rescue, and might indeed be alone in the fight against an enemy whose ambition knew no bounds. On May 24th, Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk, began under a sky streaked with smoke and uncertainty. Churchill's calculations were precise, yet hope hung by a fragile thread. The enormity of moving over 300,000 soldiers across treacherous waters under constant threat from dive bombers and U-boats demanded coordination rarely attempted in modern warfare. Civilian vessels, pressed into service, became symbols of national ingenuity and courage, threading through the chaos to snatch soldiers from imminent capture. Churchill watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety, knowing that every hour mattered, and the survival of Britain's trained forces was essential to the nation's continued resistance. As the evacuation proceeded, the Prime Minister faced the acute challenge of morale, both within the government and among the public. News from the beaches was intermittent, fragmented, yet the human drama was unmistakable. Men clinging to hulls, waves of soldiers pressing onto tiny craft, commanders coordinating withdrawals under fire. All these images became etched in Churchill's consciousness. The night that Britain might have to stand alone now included tangible evidence of sacrifice, daring, and the fragile triumph of improvisation against overwhelming odds. Military advisors stressed the urgency of preparing for German retaliation against Britain itself. Plans were drafted for the defense of ports, airfields, and industrial centers. Radar stations along the southern coast became critical nodes of early warning defense, a technological innovation that could tip the balance in Britain's favor despite its isolation. Churchill recognized that survival depended not only on manpower, but on the effective integration of intelligence, technology, and rapid decision-making. The coming days would test every aspect of strategic planning. Inside Downing Street, cabinet discussions turned to diplomacy and potential aid from the United States. Yet Churchill knew that while American support was desirable, Britain could not assume its immediacy. Political processes across the Atlantic moved slower than the pace of German advances, and there was no certainty that aid would arrive before Britain faced its most perilous moments. This awareness forced Churchill to pivot decisively toward a strategy that assumed isolation, self-reliance, resilience, and the mobilization of every available resource within the nation's borders. The Prime Minister also reflected on the psychological impact of the crisis. Newspapers carried both accurate and sensationalized accounts of the German advance. He understood that public perception could become as crucial as military action. Speeches had to be crafted to inspire determination while acknowledging danger. Churchill's genius lay in recognizing that morale could become a strategic asset, and that Britain's citizens, prepared for endurance and sacrifice, could transform potential isolation into collective strength. Meanwhile, German propaganda sought to amplify fear, portraying Britain as vulnerable and abandoned. Churchill countered this with calculated messaging, emphasizing resolve, historical identity, and the imperative of resistance. Britain's narrative had to shift from potential defeat to courageous perseverance. By framing isolation as a crucible rather than a curse, he began shaping the nation's consciousness to withstand the coming storm, embedding resilience into the very culture of survival. On the beaches of Dunkirk, every success was tempered by loss. Soldiers rescued were exhausted, traumatized, and yet vital to Britain's defensive capacity. Churchill's calculations acknowledged that the army's survival was a prerequisite for any sustained resistance, but he also knew that morale among returning troops would be fragile. Immediate care, medical support, and public recognition became as important as ammunition and fortifications. The human dimension of war, often overlooked in strategy, now became central to Britain's continued ability to resist isolation. As night fell over London, Churchill surveyed reports of evacuation progress and military dispositions. He could not rest. The specter of invasion loomed, yet he drew from the courage displayed at Dunkirk as evidence that Britain could endure. The realization that the nation might stand alone was no longer abstract. It was tangible, shaped by every perilous crossing, every improvised maneuver, and every act of extraordinary courage by soldiers and civilians alike. The night concluded not in despair, but in a fortified resolve that would define Britain's strategy in the months ahead. By the end of May 1940, France's collapse was nearly complete, and the speed of Germany's advance created a sense of inevitability that weighed heavily on Churchill. Reports from Paris described chaos in government ministries, mass civilian exodus, and the disintegration of organized resistance. The fall of France was no longer a looming possibility, it was imminent. Churchill understood that Britain's strategic position was precarious beyond any precedent in modern history. The Channel now represented not a frontier of support, but the only barrier standing between an Axis-dominated continent and the British Isles. Inside the War Cabinet, debates grew heated. Some ministers clung to the hope that a negotiated settlement with Hitler might spare Britain from invasion. Churchill rejected this notion outright. He recognized that Hitler's momentum, ideological fervor, and recent conquests made negotiation not only unlikely, but morally and strategically disastrous. Britain had to prepare to act decisively and independently. His speeches and directives began to reflect a hard truth. If France fell, Britain would have to rely on its own military, industrial, and moral resources to survive. The Royal Air Force became the linchpin of Britain's defensive strategy. Radar stations along the southern coast were upgraded and fighter squadrons dispersed to reduce vulnerability to Luftwaffe bombing. Churchill understood that control of the skies would determine whether Britain could survive isolation. Every sortie, every interception, and every pilot's endurance carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical victories. The RAF represented not only a military tool, but a symbol of national resilience, a tangible manifestation of Britain's ability to fight alone. Churchill also contemplated the nation's industrial capacity. Factories producing munitions, aircraft, and naval vessels had to operate at peak efficiency despite shortages, logistical challenges, and potential bombing. He personally reviewed production schedules, supply chains, and transportation networks. Every detail mattered. The survival of Britain's war effort depended on an economy fully mobilized and resilient to disruption. This focus on industrial endurance reflected Churchill's understanding that modern warfare extended beyond the battlefield into the very fabric of society. Civilian morale remained a central concern. Londoners and citizens across the country faced the anxiety of potential invasion and the specter of aerial bombardment. Churchill's speeches began to emphasize courage, fortitude, and shared responsibility, shaping public perception into a strategic asset. He recognized that a united, resilient population could compensate for the temporary absence of foreign military allies. Isolation, while terrifying, could be transformed into a catalyst for national solidarity, perseverance, and ingenuity. Churchill's mind often turned to naval strategy, the lifeline for supplies and troop movements. The Royal Navy had to control the Channel, protect convoys, and prepare for the possibility of direct assault on the British coast. Coordination with intelligence, air defense, and coastal fortifications became crucial. Churchill understood that Britain's survival depended on the seamless integration of these forces, each reinforcing the other to offset the lack of continental support. The calculus of defense now rested squarely on British ingenuity, foresight, and adaptability. The night sky over London became a symbol of vigilance. Anti-aircraft guns stood silhouetted against the dark, air raid sirens tested readiness, and soldiers patrolled coastal regions. Churchill reflected on the significance of these measures. The nation was entering a prolonged trial, one that required constant attention to detail, unwavering discipline, and faith in collective endurance. The Prime Minister's awareness of human resilience became as critical as his military calculations. He knew that Britain's capacity to withstand isolation depended equally on courage and planning. As May gave way to June, Churchill's realization solidified: Britain might indeed stand alone. The fate of the continent seemed sealed, and no immediate relief could be counted on from distant allies. Yet, within this stark awareness, Churchill found determination. The nation could endure, resist, and ultimately confront the Axis powers, provided it acted with unity, intelligence, and resolve. That night, the weight of isolation transformed into a strategic and moral imperative. Britain would survive on its own terms, or not at all. June 1940 opened with grim intelligence confirming the speed of the German conquest. Paris was on the brink, the French government teetered, and the Wehrmacht had achieved an operational momentum that seemed unstoppable. Churchill realized that contingency planning for potential invasion of Britain was no longer theoretical. Every coastal defense, every radar installation, every RAF sortie had to function as part of a coordinated shield to protect the nation's sovereignty. The Prime Minister understood that Britain's independence would rely entirely on the efficiency and courage of its own forces. Amid these developments, Churchill's speeches and communications took on a prophetic urgency. He framed the struggle in moral terms, invoking history, duty, and the collective courage of the British people. Public addresses emphasized the necessity of enduring isolation without despair, cultivating determination through narrative, and inspiring citizens to participate in the national defense. Britain's identity, Churchill understood, would be tested not just militarily but psychologically, requiring every citizen to internalize the responsibility of survival. Preparations for the potential fall of France intensified. Evacuation plans were refined, coastal artillery batteries reinforced, and civilian networks organized for rapid response. Each decision reflected meticulous foresight. If the continent was lost, Britain's response had to be immediate, coordinated, and decisive. The Prime Minister balanced urgency with prudence, understanding that any miscalculation could compound the consequences of isolation and leave the nation vulnerable to invasion. Churchill also considered economic resilience. Trade routes, imports, and essential materials faced disruption if German control of Europe extended to the Atlantic. Securing supply chains, stockpiling critical resources, and maintaining industrial output became vital components of a strategy that assumed Britain could be cut off from allies for an extended period. Every factory, dock, and transportation hub became a node in the web of national survival. The RAF faced continuous pressure. Intelligence reports indicated an increasing concentration of Luftwaffe forces over northern France, preparing for potential strikes against southern England. Churchill recognized that Britain's future depended on sustained air defense, requiring innovation, courage, and a calculated willingness to risk pilots in pivotal engagements. Air superiority became synonymous with national survival, transforming every aerial battle into a critical test of the country's capacity to endure alone. Civilian life adapted under the shadow of uncertainty. Blackout measures, air raid drills, and civil defense initiatives permeated daily routines. Churchill knew that public compliance, resilience, and morale were as crucial as artillery or aircraft. Isolation was not merely a strategic condition. It was a lived reality that required national cohesion and shared purpose to prevent fear from undermining the war effort. Churchill's personal reflections became increasingly philosophical. He understood that Britain's isolation represented not only a military challenge, but a historical inflection point. The survival of democratic institutions, civil liberties, and national identity depended on the capacity to resist not only invasion but psychological despair. Leadership in such times required constant calibration of strategy, morality, and hope, a balance that could inspire citizens to endure in the face of unprecedented danger. By mid-June, it was clear the continent was slipping away. Churchill's resolve hardened. Isolation was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. Yet in acknowledging this truth, he began to forge a path of strategic clarity, national resilience, and moral fortitude. Britain would not rely on others. It would rely on its own courage, resources, and ingenuity to confront an enemy whose ambitions threatened to engulf Europe entirely. The nation's destiny, once tethered to alliances, now rested solely on itself. By late June 1940, France had formally surrendered, and the shockwave of defeat reverberated across Europe. Churchill, now fully conscious of Britain's isolation, faced the daunting task of preparing a nation to resist alone. He understood that this was not merely a strategic challenge, it was a moral and psychological one. Every decision, from the deployment of troops to public addresses, had to fortify the national will while simultaneously shoring up defenses against an enemy whose triumph on the continent seemed complete. In cabinet meetings, debates turned urgent and at times fractious. Some ministers argued for negotiation or appeasement to preserve life and infrastructure. Churchill dismissed such notions as both morally indefensible and strategically dangerous. Hitler's actions demonstrated a relentless drive for dominance, a vision incompatible with compromise. Britain could no longer hope to rely on continental allies. It had to cultivate self-reliance, endurance, and the ability to strike decisively when opportunity allowed. The Royal Navy became the centerpiece of national defense. Commanders prepared to defend the Channel against potential German incursions, ensuring the safety of convoys, the integrity of the coastline, and the preservation of naval supremacy. Churchill recognized that control of the seas was Britain's ultimate insurance against invasion. Each ship, each crew, and each coordinated maneuver represented not only military might, but the tangible embodiment of a nation's capacity to remain unconquered while standing alone. Air power, too, took on monumental significance. The RAF faced the immense task of repelling Luftwaffe attacks that were now focused on establishing aerial dominance over Britain. Radar stations, dispersed airfields, and rapid response squadrons became critical in an environment where every sortie could tip the balance between survival and catastrophe. Churchill's calculations emphasized that Britain's independence depended on more than courage. It relied on the precise orchestration of human skill, technology, and logistical foresight. The civilian population became integral to the nation's defense. Blackouts, civil defense drills, and emergency preparedness transformed ordinary streets and homes into arenas of national resilience. Churchill understood that the spirit of the population could become as decisive as any weapon. Their endurance, cooperation, and morale were central to Britain's ability to withstand prolonged isolation and the psychological pressure of standing against an enemy that dominated the continent. Churchill's speeches began to articulate the gravity of the situation with unmatched eloquence. He framed Britain's isolation not as abandonment, but as a test of courage, resolve, and moral clarity. His words sought to galvanize a nation, transforming fear into collective determination. By emphasizing shared purpose and invoking history, he began forging a psychological shield as critical as any coastal battery or fighter squadron. Every hour brought new intelligence about German plans and troop movements. Churchill studied these reports with meticulous attention, aware that even minor miscalculations could compound the risks of isolation. He anticipated potential invasion scenarios, considered strategic withdrawals, and explored every possible contingency to ensure that Britain could endure without reliance on foreign assistance. His focus combined foresight, pragmatism, and an unwavering sense of responsibility for the nation's survival. By the end of June, the reality of Britain standing alone had crystallized. Continental Europe was largely under Axis control, the United States had yet to commit to direct support, and the nation faced an uncertain, potentially prolonged struggle. Churchill's response was clear: Britain would not surrender, negotiate, or waver. Its defense, morale, and future would rest entirely on its own capabilities. Isolation was not a weakness to lament. It was a crucible in which the nation's courage, ingenuity, and identity would be forged. As July dawned, Churchill's focus intensified on the imminent threat of German invasion. Intelligence suggested the Luftwaffe's build-up across the Channel, while coastal reconnaissance identified key vulnerabilities. Churchill and his generals calculated the exact placement of artillery, minefields, and rapid response units. Every aspect of Britain's defense now required integration of army, navy, and air force, coordinated with civilian readiness. The nation's survival depended on a synergy of military precision and public resilience, all operating under the looming specter of isolation. The Prime Minister recognized the symbolic as well as strategic importance of public morale. Speeches, radio broadcasts, and carefully orchestrated propaganda aimed to cultivate courage, unity, and shared purpose. Churchill understood that a frightened population could undermine the military effort. Conversely, a resilient populace could act as a force multiplier. Isolation was no longer abstract. It was a lived reality, shaping the rhythm of daily life and the psychological preparation for potential catastrophe. Industrial production became a critical front in the fight. Factories expanded output under strict schedules, with workers pushed to meet the demands of aircraft, munitions, and naval vessels. Churchill personally monitored production statistics, understanding that supply lines, materials, and labor were as vital to survival as soldiers in the field. The nation's industry became an extension of its strategic defenses, ensuring that even in isolation, Britain could sustain its war effort. The RAF's role grew more critical as Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights tested Britain's defenses. Fighter squadrons scrambled to intercept incoming raids, radar stations tracked enemy movements, and strategic dispersal minimized vulnerability. Churchill grasped that the battle for air supremacy would determine whether Britain could endure long-term isolation or face direct invasion. Every pilot, engineer, and radar operator became a frontline actor in a war fought both in the skies and in the hearts of the people. Churchill's strategic calculations also included diplomatic foresight. While Britain could not rely on immediate assistance, cultivating political goodwill with the United States became a parallel priority. Yet, he did not allow diplomacy to distract from preparation. Independence was essential. The nation had to survive the coming months without assuming relief from foreign powers, reinforcing a mindset of self-reliance that would prove crucial in the darkest hours. The human dimension of war remained central. Londoners, coastal communities, and factory workers adapted to blackout conditions, civil defense drills, and the constant threat of air raids. Churchill knew that their endurance was inseparable from military success. Isolation would test not only strategy and technology but courage, discipline, and the capacity to sustain hope in the face of existential threat. Each citizen became a participant in the national defense, their resilience a decisive element of Britain's survival. Churchill also contemplated potential invasion scenarios with relentless scrutiny. Strategic reserves, rapid deployment units, and coastal artillery had to be positioned with precision. Every contingency, from amphibious landings to sabotage behind enemy lines, was examined and rehearsed. The Prime Minister understood that preparedness alone would not guarantee survival, but it could tip the balance in Britain's favor, turning potential despair into calculated resilience. By the end of July, Britain had solidified a precarious but determined stance. Continental Europe had fallen, the United States remained neutral but sympathetic, and the nation faced the reality of standing alone. Churchill's realization that Britain must depend solely on itself had transformed from intellectual awareness into practical strategy, psychological conditioning, and moral purpose. The island nation now braced for an unprecedented test of courage, endurance, and identity, fully aware that its survival rested entirely on its own ingenuity and resolve. August 1940 arrived with the relentless hum of preparation and anxiety. Britain's forces, though intact, faced the daunting task of defending against an enemy that dominated the continent. Churchill's attention was unwavering. Every coastal defense, radar installation, and airfield had to be operational, synchronized, and ready for immediate action. The reality of isolation was now complete. No immediate continental reinforcements could be expected, and survival rested solely on the ingenuity and courage of British forces. The Battle of Britain began to take shape in Churchill's mind not as a future event, but as an imminent struggle for the survival of the nation. Fighter command squadrons trained under extreme pressure, and radar stations reported continuous enemy reconnaissance. Churchill understood that control of the skies was not merely tactical, it was existential. Every successful interception of a Luftwaffe raid could delay or prevent invasion, preserving the lifeline of an island standing defiantly alone. Civilians became both witnesses and participants in the defense. Air raid sirens, blackout curtains, and emergency shelters transformed the urban landscape into a theater of endurance. Churchill's speeches highlighted their crucial role, emphasizing that every citizen's compliance and courage contributed to national survival. Isolation, once a political reality, now became a lived experience. The resilience of the population was inseparable from the strategic calculus of the military. Churchill also focused on sustaining industrial output under unprecedented pressure. Aircraft production soared, munitions factories operated around the clock, and shipyards worked tirelessly to maintain naval supremacy. Every dock, factory, and conveyor belt became a vital node in a network designed to withstand the Axis threat without foreign support. Industrial discipline, efficiency, and innovation were as decisive as any battlefield engagement. The psychological stakes were immense. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and propaganda conveyed the gravity of the struggle while fostering determination. Churchill recognized that morale could become a weapon, shaping perception as powerfully as artillery or aircraft. Public confidence, unity, and endurance became critical to national survival, transforming fear into purposeful resilience. On the southern coast, the threat of invasion loomed palpably. German reconnaissance suggested the potential for amphibious landings, prompting Churchill to coordinate coastal defenses, rapid response units, and mobile reserves. Each artillery placement, minefield, and patrol became a calculated component in a broader strategy designed to compensate for isolation and delay or repel the enemy. Precision, foresight, and decisiveness defined every movement. The Prime Minister's attention also turned to communication. Maintaining secure, reliable channels between military commanders, government ministries, and civilian authorities was essential. Disruption of coordination could have catastrophic consequences. Churchill understood that in isolation, the nation's ability to act cohesively would be tested more severely than its ability to fight. Every signal, report, and instruction was a thread in the fabric of national survival. As August waned, the contours of Britain's strategy crystallized. Isolation had shifted from potential to reality, and the island nation now relied entirely on its own defenses, population, and resources. Churchill's resolve was unshakable. Britain would endure, resist, and confront the Axis powers on its own terms. The coming weeks would define not only the course of the war, but the identity and courage of an entire nation standing alone against a formidable adversary. September 1940 marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's sustained offensive, later known as the Battle of Britain. The scale and intensity of the aerial bombardment tested every facet of Churchill's preparations. Fighter squadrons scrambled repeatedly, radar stations tracked waves of enemy aircraft, and anti-aircraft batteries fired relentlessly. Churchill's realization that Britain's survival depended entirely on its own forces crystallized in every engagement, each interception, and each civilian casualty. The psychological impact on civilians was profound. Night after night, Londoners and southern communities endured the thunder of bombs, fires, and destruction. Churchill's speeches and broadcasts sought to transform fear into purpose, reminding citizens that their courage and resilience were as vital as any fighter pilot in the sky. Isolation was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a tangible, lived experience that required collective fortitude and unwavering resolve. Industrial output, critical to sustaining resistance, faced unprecedented demands. Factories producing aircraft, munitions, and naval vessels pushed to maximum capacity. Workers endured long hours in dangerous conditions, often under the threat of bombing. Churchill personally monitored production statistics, understanding that Britain's ability to withstand isolation depended on continuous supply and innovation. Industrial endurance became inseparable from military success. Military strategy evolved daily. Churchill coordinated RAF squadrons with anti-aircraft batteries, naval patrols, and civilian civil defense measures. Every sortie, interception, and maneuver was meticulously calculated to maximize effectiveness and conserve resources. Isolation magnified the stakes. Without continental reinforcements, every loss carried amplified consequences. Britain's defensive strategy became a delicate balance of risk, innovation, and endurance. Churchill's reflections also embraced the moral dimension of leadership. He recognized that in times of isolation, the nation's spirit was as decisive as its firepower. Public addresses emphasized duty, shared sacrifice, and the imperative to resist despair. By framing the struggle in moral as well as strategic terms, Churchill sought to cultivate a collective identity capable of withstanding both physical and psychological assaults. The Royal Navy maintained vigilance along the Channel, protecting convoys and coastal regions from potential incursion. Every ship's movement was scrutinized, coordinated, and optimized to preserve Britain's lifeline. Naval operations became a central pillar of survival, compensating for the absence of Allied support on the continent. Each successful patrol or convoy mission reinforced the nation's capacity to endure alone. Civil defense initiatives intensified. Air raid shelters, first aid stations, and emergency services were expanded to protect civilians from the relentless Luftwaffe attacks. Churchill's understanding of human resilience informed policy and strategy alike. The population's ability to endure hardship directly influenced Britain's capacity to withstand isolation. Social cohesion became a strategic asset as vital as aircraft or artillery. By the end of September, Britain had withstood the initial assaults. The RAF had secured temporary air superiority, civilian morale remained resilient, and the island nation's defenses had proven robust. Churchill's foresight, preparation, and leadership had transformed isolation from vulnerability into a crucible of resilience. Britain had demonstrated that, standing alone, it could resist even the most formidable enemy, setting the stage for the prolonged struggle to come. By October 1940, the Battle of Britain had escalated into a prolonged struggle that tested every dimension of Britain's defenses. Churchill's awareness of isolation had transformed into a guiding principle of governance. The nation could rely on no ally for immediate support. Every decision, from aircraft deployment to radar station positioning, required meticulous calculation. The enemy's relentless pressure magnified the stakes, and Churchill understood that Britain's survival rested entirely on the integration of strategy, technology, and human endurance. The RAF, under immense strain, became both a symbol and instrument of resistance. Pilots faced grueling sorties, often flying multiple missions a day under intense pressure. Their bravery exemplified Churchill's vision, a nation capable of defending itself with determination and ingenuity. Each aerial engagement was a test of skill, endurance, and morale. Success or failure directly influenced the psychological resilience of civilians and the military alike. Isolation had made every battle consequential. Civilian life adapted to the new rhythm of war. Blackouts, air raid drills, and the omnipresent threat of bombs transformed homes, streets, and public spaces into arenas of survival. Churchill understood that the population's endurance was inseparable from military success. Every citizen's cooperation, courage, and fortitude became a strategic resource. The psychological dimension of isolation demanded not only leadership but shared purpose, instilling a collective identity rooted in resilience and national pride. Industrial output continued to surge despite constant pressure and intermittent bombing. Factories producing aircraft, munitions, and naval vessels operated at unprecedented levels, supported by logistical networks that ensured the continuous flow of resources. Churchill monitored these operations personally, recognizing that Britain's capacity to endure isolation depended as much on the home front as on the battlefield. Industry, strategy, and morale formed an integrated system of national defense. Naval operations remained critical to survival. The Royal Navy patrolled the Channel, protected convoys, and maintained strategic dominance over potential invasion routes. Churchill knew that maritime control was the backbone of Britain's isolation strategy. Without it, the nation would be vulnerable to direct attack and disruption of essential supplies. Every patrol, convoy, and engagement reinforced the island's independence and capacity to endure. Churchill's speeches, increasingly resolute and evocative, emphasized moral courage alongside strategic acumen. He framed isolation as a defining test of national character, appealing to shared history, duty, and collective identity. Public addresses sought to transform fear into determination, ensuring that citizens understood their role in the defense of the nation. Isolation was no longer simply a strategic reality. It was a crucible shaping the courage and resolve of Britain's people. Intelligence reports highlighted German adaptations, including new bombing tactics and reconnaissance missions. Churchill's response was dynamic. Air defenses were repositioned, RAF squadrons rotated, and contingency plans refined. Every measure reflected the harsh calculus of a nation preparing to survive on its own, demonstrating that foresight and adaptability were essential weapons alongside guns, planes, and ships. By late October, Britain had proven its capacity to endure despite isolation. The Luftwaffe's initial momentum had been checked, civilian morale remained resilient, and industrial output sustained the war effort. Churchill's realization that Britain might have to stand alone had matured into a practical. November 1940 brought renewed challenges. The Blitz intensified as German forces shifted tactics, targeting London and industrial centers. Churchill, fully conscious of Britain's isolation, coordinated every defense measure with meticulous care. Fighter command, anti-aircraft batteries, and civil defense units operated in constant synchronization. Isolation was no longer abstract. It shaped every tactical decision, every emergency response, and every public address. The human toll was immense. Civilians endured bombings, fires, and destruction of homes and infrastructure. Churchill's speeches emphasized resilience, urging citizens to persist despite suffering. He understood that public morale was as decisive as military operations. A resilient population fortified the nation's ability to resist an enemy that had conquered much of Europe. Isolation magnified the significance of courage, endurance, and unity. Factories and industrial hubs operated under extreme conditions. Workers, aware of the stakes, maintained output of aircraft, munitions, and naval vessels. Churchill monitored production personally, recognizing that industrial capacity was inseparable from survival. Every ship built, plane assembled, and shell produced represented a tangible defense against the Axis threat, demonstrating that Britain's isolation could be transformed into purposeful action. Military strategy evolved with each Luftwaffe assault. Fighter squadrons engaged relentlessly, radar stations tracked movements, and the Navy maintained channel dominance. Churchill understood that coordination and innovation could offset the absence of continental allies. Every successful defense, every intercepted raid, and every protected convoy reinforced Britain's capacity to endure on its own, solidifying isolation as a strategic condition rather than a liability. The psychological impact of isolation extended to leadership itself. Churchill bore the weight of responsibility with unrelenting focus, aware that miscalculation could imperil the nation. Cabinet meetings, operational briefings, and strategic discussions reflected an intense interplay between moral clarity and practical foresight. Leadership under isolation demanded both courage and meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that every decision contributed to national resilience. Churchill's public communication became an essential weapon. Speeches framed the struggle as a test of national character, invoking history, duty, and shared sacrifice. He cultivated hope without illusion, balancing realism with inspiration. The public, internalizing this message, became a strategic asset, demonstrating that psychological resilience could amplify military effectiveness in the absence of allies. Naval and air operations worked in tandem to maintain strategic flexibility. Convoys, coastal patrols, and fighter deployments created a web of defense capable of responding to diverse threats. Isolation required adaptability. The nation could not rely on reinforcements, so every asset had to be optimized, coordinated, and conserved. Churchill's vision integrated all components of defense into a seamless system designed to sustain Britain through the crisis. By the end of November, Britain had endured the first phase of sustained isolation. The Blitz, though devastating, had not broken civilian resolve. The RAF maintained operational capability, and industrial production continued. Churchill's realization that Britain might stand alone had evolved into a practical strategy that combined military ingenuity, civil resilience, and moral fortitude. The nation's survival was now a testament to preparation, courage, and unity under extraordinary pressure. December 1940 marked the midpoint of Britain's solitary struggle. The Luftwaffe continued intermittent raids, testing the resilience of both military forces and civilians. Churchill's focus remained unwavering. The nation had to endure, adapt, and consolidate its defenses. The isolation that once seemed terrifying now became a crucible in which Britain's military, industrial, and social systems proved their strength. Every sortie, patrol, and factory shift reinforced the principle that survival depended solely on national capacity. Civilians faced continuous hardship. Blackouts, bombings, and rationing demanded discipline and resilience. Churchill recognized that the population's fortitude was inseparable from military effectiveness. Each citizen's compliance and courage amplified the nation's capacity to resist, demonstrating that psychological and social cohesion could compensate for the absence of allies on the continent. Industrial output reached unprecedented levels. Factories adapted to wartime conditions, producing aircraft, munitions, and ships at scale. Churchill personally tracked progress, understanding that industrial efficiency under pressure was as decisive as any battle. Isolation made every output critical. The nation had to rely on its own ingenuity to maintain the flow of essential resources. Military coordination deepened. RAF squadrons rotated to conserve strength, radar stations provided early warnings, and naval patrols maintained dominance of the channel. Churchill's strategy accounted for multiple contingencies, anticipating enemy adaptations and ensuring flexibility in response. Isolation demanded foresight, rapid decision-making, and the integration of all military branches into a cohesive defense network. Churchill's speeches emphasized moral clarity and purpose. He framed Britain's endurance as a defining struggle of freedom against tyranny, instilling both realism and hope. Public perception became a strategic asset. Citizens' courage, cooperation, and sense of duty strengthened the nation's capacity to withstand pressure, transforming isolation from vulnerability into resilience. Intelligence reports revealed German strategic adjustments, including potential invasion planning and intensified aerial campaigns. Churchill responded with operational refinements, dispersal of airfields, reinforcement of coastal batteries, and continuous rotation of naval patrols. Isolation magnified the consequences of error, making meticulous attention to detail essential. Every action was a measure against vulnerability, designed to maintain national independence. The psychological stakes for leadership were immense. Churchill bore the responsibility of guiding a nation through unprecedented isolation, balancing strategic pragmatism with moral inspiration. Cabinet decisions, operational directives, and public communications reflected an acute awareness of the intertwined fates of military success and civilian endurance. Leadership itself became a test of resilience. By the close of 1940, Britain had survived 6 months of solitary struggle. Continental Europe had fallen, the United States remained uninvolved militarily, and Germany's threat loomed constantly. Churchill's realization that Britain might stand alone had matured into a multidimensional strategy, blending military ingenuity, industrial endurance, and social cohesion. The nation had endured, proving that isolation could be transformed into purpose and resilience. January 1941 brought the stark reality of prolonged isolation. Winter intensified logistical challenges, threatening supply lines, infrastructure, and civilian morale. Churchill, fully cognizant of Britain's solitary status, oversaw adaptations in transport, production, and military deployment to maintain readiness. The nation's capacity to endure hardship became a measure of survival, illustrating that isolation demanded both preparation and ingenuity. The RAF faced ongoing threats from reconnaissance and sporadic bombing. Squadrons maintained constant readiness, adapting tactics to conserve resources and counter evolving enemy strategies. Every engagement underscored the principle that Britain could not rely on external support. Success depended on careful planning, skill, and courage under pressure. Air power had become the nation's most immediate line of defense. Civilian endurance continued to be critical. Blackouts, rationing, and civil defense procedures were sustained with remarkable discipline. Churchill's communications framed these hardships as contributions to national survival, emphasizing collective responsibility. Isolation had transformed daily life into a strategic endeavor, where each act of resilience reinforced the nation's ability to withstand prolonged adversity. Industrial production adapted to winter challenges. Factories continued to supply aircraft, naval vessels, and munitions despite resource constraints and infrastructure difficulties. Churchill understood that industrial capacity was inseparable from military success, and every unit produced represented a tangible defense against a potential invasion. Innovation and efficiency became critical weapons in a nation standing alone. Naval and coastal defenses were refined. Channel patrols, minefields, and coastal artillery were continuously adjusted based on intelligence. Churchill recognized that maritime control was the key to maintaining Britain's isolation as a strategic advantage. The Royal Navy, alongside coordinated air defenses, created a layered shield against the Axis threat. Churchill's leadership balanced realism with inspiration. Public speeches highlighted both the gravity of the situation and the nation's capacity to endure. By framing isolation as a test of courage, fortitude, and shared purpose, Churchill cultivated a psychological resilience that complemented military readiness. Civilian and military efforts became mutually reinforcing, forming a cohesive national strategy. Intelligence indicated continued German preparations along the Channel coast. Churchill anticipated potential invasion attempts, revising defensive deployments, fortifying key positions, and maintaining operational flexibility. Every precaution reflected the necessity of self-reliance and the impossibility of depending on external military aid. Isolation required constant vigilance and proactive measures. By the end of January 1941, Britain's position had solidified. Despite the fall of continental Europe, relentless aerial bombardment, and harsh winter conditions, the nation demonstrated remarkable resilience. Churchill's realization that Britain might have to stand alone had guided the integration of military, industrial, and civilian resources into a coherent strategy. Isolation had become a defining feature of national identity and strategic planning, shaping Britain's path forward. February 1941 marked the culmination of Britain's adaptation to solitary survival. The Luftwaffe's offensive had abated temporarily, providing the nation with a moment to consolidate defenses. Churchill's foresight and meticulous preparation had transformed isolation from vulnerability into strategic advantage. Every aspect of defense, from air power and naval control to civilian morale and industrial output, operated in unison, ensuring the nation's endurance. The Royal Navy maintained dominance over the Channel, safeguarding convoys and reinforcing coastal defenses. Its strategic control ensured that Britain's lifelines remained secure, demonstrating that isolation need not equate to vulnerability. Every ship, crew, and patrol became a tangible manifestation of national independence, reinforcing the island's capacity to survive unassisted. The RAF, though fatigued, remained a symbol of resilience. Pilots, engineers, and radar operators had sustained operations under extreme conditions, achieving a level of coordination and effectiveness that epitomized Churchill's vision. Air superiority became both practical and symbolic, signifying Britain's ability to resist the Axis on its own terms. Civilian courage remained central. Blackouts, rationing, and voluntary participation in civil defense measures exemplified collective resilience. Churchill's speeches had instilled a sense of purpose, transforming daily hardship into a contribution to national survival. Isolation became a crucible that forged unity, discipline, and an unshakable sense of identity among citizens. Industrial production, optimized and sustained under pressure, continued to supply the military. Aircraft, munitions, and naval vessels flowed from factories to the front lines, demonstrating that Britain could marshal its internal resources to compensate for the absence of allies. Efficiency, innovation, and determination became essential weapons in a nation standing alone. Churchill's leadership had crystallized into a synthesis of strategic foresight, moral clarity, and personal resolve. He understood that isolation demanded continuous adaptation, coordination, and psychological fortitude. Every decision, whether operational, industrial, or communicative, contributed to a coherent strategy that allowed Britain to endure against overwhelming odds. By February 1941, Britain had proven that standing alone was not merely a possibility, but a sustainable reality. The nation's military, civilian, and industrial systems had adapted to the absence of immediate continental support. Churchill's realization, initially a chilling acknowledgement of vulnerability, had evolved into a blueprint for endurance, resilience, and strategic ingenuity. The night that once symbolized uncertainty had transformed into a testament to national resolve. Britain, guided by foresight, courage, and cohesion, had survived its first months of solitary struggle. Churchill's recognition that the nation might stand alone had forged not despair, but purpose, a purpose that would sustain Britain through the trials to come and define its role in the wider war.